Today, I wrap up a month-long podcast series on boundaries, and today's episode is where all of this truly has been leading. I've talked about how important boundaries are. I've talked about boundaries around sex in a sexless marriage, around criticism, around respect, around emotional withdrawal, being taken for granted, boundaries around protecting the integrity of your marriage. But all of those are really just components of what this is all about. One thing: your self-worth. Not the marriage, not the dynamic that you're in, not the situation, not her behavior, you and your self-worth. A lot of guys don't realize until they start the healing journey that if your sense of self-worth is not rock solid, no boundary is going to hold. It's a catch-22 because it's hard to hold a boundary when your sense of self-worth is diminished, but you need to be able to hold the boundaries to be able to help build that sense of self-worth. We get caught in this trap. That's why nervous system regulation is so important. Go back to that podcast series last month, because your nervous system will allow you to hold the boundaries, which helps build your self-worth, which is the foundation of future boundaries. And anxious men struggle so much because of that very reason. We talked about also that boundaries, there's external boundaries, but there's also internal boundaries. At the surface level, at the cognitive level, we know the things that we need to say to hold boundaries. That's not the problem. We already know what feels right to us and what doesn't. We know when something crosses a line. At the core of all of this is this idea of trusting yourself enough to hold that line, to hold that boundary. And that's why we tend to backtrack off of our boundaries or second guess, or we try to maybe soften the impact of it. And again, it's that sense of your nervous system, the anxiety and fear saying, if I hold this boundary, I might lose her. Goes back to those childhood wounds of, if I stand up for myself, I face abandonment. When you're a child, it's life and death. So for anxious men, that fear is intense. And so we tend to neglect our self-respect and dignity for peace, or what we believe to be peace, and that connection. But every time you do that, your self-worth takes a hit. And if you continue to self-abandon, then it just compounds on top of that. Because remember, self-abandonment didn't start in your marriage. It started a lot earlier. I've talked about this a lot in the podcast. If you grew up in a home where conflict felt unsafe, if your approval was conditional, or if love had to be earned, then you learned a strategy to be agreeable, to be easygoing, don't be a problem, be good, be helpful, don't rock the boat. That's a strategy that you learned to help you survive as a child, but in adult relationships, it creates this painful pattern because instead of showing up as your full self, you show up as a version of you that you believe will be accepted. And over time, you lose that sense of who you really are. And as you lose that sense of who you are, it chips away little by little at your sense of self-worth. When we go back, we talked about self-abandonment. When you say yes, when you want to really say no, or if you apologize for something you didn't do, or if you're tolerating disrespect just to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, if you're overgiving, people-pleasing, ignoring your own needs just to keep the peace, you feel like you're doing what you need to do to be a good husband, but over time it builds resentment. And you feel even more disconnected in your marriage. It's because you've been abandoning yourself. And so when you abandon yourself, we feel that in our self-worth because that's the foundation. And that's the foundation of setting boundaries, is self-worth. Boundaries will naturally emerge when your self-worth improves. So when you truly believe in your core, in your soul, deep in your heart, my voice matters, my needs matter, I matter, you'll stop tolerating things that violate that. And when you do that, you no longer feel the need to negotiate your worth. You just simply live by that. You live from it. I am worthy. Now, what do those boundaries look like? We talked a lot about the different boundaries over this past month. You improve your sense of self-worth by holding a boundary around the sexual integrity in your marriage, by holding a boundary around disrespect. If you've just found this podcast for the first time, I encourage you, go back and listen to the previous 4 or 5 episodes. And as you set those external boundaries around those different areas, around respect or criticism or emotional withdrawal, but it's more than just those external boundaries. Remember, the most important boundaries you set are with yourself. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That first step of the secure husband process is noticing, it's awareness. And from there, it's making a conscious decision to take action. So from there, you make a conscious decision to not override my feelings anymore to keep someone else comfortable. I'm not going to chase someone who's pulling away. I'm not going to collapse when I feel rejected. I'm not going to over-explain to earn approval. I'm not going to abandon myself to maintain connection with this woman. Those are decisions you make within yourself. Those are boundaries internally. Once you make those decisions, then your external behavior begins to change. Because so many guys that I work with, and myself included, I've been there, we will spend an entire marriage trying to be the perfect husband. We are not good at conflict. We are overgivers. We constantly are trying to meet our wife's expectations because that's what we believed we are supposed to be doing. But somehow we feel empty, lonely, resentful. And once you notice that, then you start setting those boundaries with yourself, those internal boundaries. Once you begin noticing where you're abandoning yourself, noticing where you're chasing approval, noticing where you're saying yes just out of fear, slowly you can begin to choose differently and set external boundaries once you set those internal boundaries. From there, over time, you will feel more grounded. You will feel more confident and stable. And that helps build that sense of self-worth. And that's where you stop the whole catch-22 loop, because you're no longer showing up from neediness. You're showing up from self-respect. And that's because you've built that sense of self-worth and confidence. And it's fear. It is fear. It is fear driving the whole thing. Because the fear that sits underneath all of this is, again, if I stop abandoning myself, what if I lose the marriage? If I stop people-pleasing, what happens? Will I make her mad? Will I push her away? If you've listened to this podcast you know that when you stop chasing, you stop over-functioning. When you stop tolerating everything, that changes the dynamic. Is it a guarantee that your wife will come back? No. Might she not like the new you? No. But you've changed the dynamic. I will say that in the majority of cases, mine included, and a lot of the guys I've worked with, when you change that dynamic, sometimes it's not going to be easy. Sometimes it will create a sense of tension in your marriage. Sometimes your partner's going to push back. Sometimes there's going to be uncertainty. But if a relationship only works when you abandon yourself, it's already unstable. It's already dysfunctional. Real connection requires 2 people. So when you stop these things, your self-worth begins to improve. And when that happens, in many cases, your wife now sees things in you that she's never seen before, and that's attractive. That is what happens in the majority of cases. In some cases, she doesn't like the fact that you're no longer a doormat, and the marriage does come to an end. But a real marriage, again, is not one person carrying the entire emotional weight. And that's what I talk about, radical acceptance and getting clarity about what this relationship truly looks like and the future of this relationship. And that is a result of self-worth, building self-worth. And when you do that, that helps you overcome that fear. When you can soothe your nervous system in the process of this, then building self-worth becomes very clear because you're able to hold the boundaries. You're able to do this from a calm, clear tone. You're not over-explaining. You're not tolerating the disrespect anymore. You're not losing yourself in someone else and their mood, building male friendships, building your purpose. You're staying grounded now. Notice I didn't say perfect, because there's not one person walking the face of this earth who's perfect. But you are grounded now and steady. And that steadiness changes how you experience the relationship. And you stop needing constant validation because you're validating yourself. That sense of self-worth now is building. And when you stabilize that, one of the biggest shifts that happens, and you stop needing constant validation, you no longer depend on your partner's mood to feel okay. Remember the definition of codependence. I'm okay only if you are okay. If you're not okay, I'm not okay. Now you stop chasing that. You're not spiraling when they withdraw and collapsing when they criticize. Your sense of self is now internal and not external and outsourced. It comes from within. And that's the biggest boundary of all. The boundary around protecting your self-worth. Not fixing your wife, not controlling the relationship, not trying to be the perfect husband. It's becoming a grounded man anchored in himself who knows his values, knows his self-worth. And from there, he's regulating his nervous system, he's regulating his emotions. He holds his boundaries externally, holds those boundaries internally. And you lead yourself and you lead your marriage, because then everything else begins to change. If you take nothing else from this entire month-long series on boundaries, just remember the most important boundary you're ever going to set is the one where you stop abandoning yourself. Because you cannot build a healthy marriage on a foundation where one person disappears. And you and only you are the person that can decide, is this working for me? Because I am worthy of happiness and peace in a marriage. I hope you enjoyed this month-long series on boundaries. I will say that the podcast earlier this month on boundaries around a sexless marriage really touched a nerve. I got a ton of feedback on that. And so when thinking about what this next month is going to look like in terms of podcasts, I think the sexless marriage is probably the biggest pain point that a lot of men I work with and that listen to this podcast are challenged with. And so that is going to be our topic for next month. I really enjoy doing these month-long series. I hope that I hope you get as much out of them as I get out of creating them. We're going to do that next month. It is going to be all about dealing with the sexless marriage, the dead bedroom. If you're catching this podcast for the very first time and you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. If you are a regular listener and you listen to this podcast frequently, would you take 2 minutes and go to your favorite platform, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever that is, review this podcast. That helps the algorithms share it so that other men can find this for their own healing. And if this podcast is something that you think somebody you know might benefit from, share this episode. And if you're struggling in your marriage, if you need somebody to help guide you through all of this, I encourage you to visit securehusband.com and just fill out that form for a free 30-minute consultation. It's just a conversation to see if maybe one-on-one coaching might be right for you. And I'll see you on the next Secure Husband podcast. Thanks for listening.